the narthex, which is cold, instead of being in the sanctuary, which is warm, is another matter altogether. So if you're standing out there, or if you're in the lobby nourishing your cup of coffee, this is your, warning is too strong a word, your prompt to come in and make yourself present in the sanctuary. We have quite an assortment of things happening in the next hour and beyond. The thing I'd like to lift up most are two things happening directly after this service. Our usual coffee time will be in the lobby itself, because we are holding an event for lunch that is a paid event. Our Choice Fund is hosting their annual Choice event. It's a meal, it's an auction, and you can still attend if you're willing to pay for the privilege, which helps to support the Choice Fund that supports poor women in need of reproductive health services. You may also then move on through the rest of your day, but there is an exhibit that just opened last week in our gallery that's worth seeing. And then I remind you that this is the Dr. King weekend, and many things are taking place. This evening, over at the DeVos Arts and Worship Center on the campus of Christian High School, the community worship service will take place with varieties of clergy and the community choir, of which many members of this choir and beyond take part. It's always exuberant and always worth the experience. Again, it used to be at New Hope. It is this year at the Arts and Worship Center on the campus of Christian High School on Plymouth Avenue. Tomorrow night, virtually at the same time, both nights, 6 p.m., the College Consortium, which consists of GVSU and Grand Rapids Community College and others, will again host a community observance of the Dr. King holiday or day of service in this sanctuary with a wonderful speaker who is one of the exonerated 5. I remind you that those were 5 young men ultimately cleared of the convictions that were associated with the victim in Central Park years ago, that it was in some respects prompted by the current incumbent of the White House is not news, nor is it irrelevant. But that will be here tomorrow night. More music and other speakers, 6 p.m. tomorrow. I think that covers the stuff that's coming up right now. Our choir is making their entrance, and so I'll call upon Jonathan to summon us to worship with our prelude this morning. Welcome to Fountain Street Church. too many choices in words that I could offer this morning. From long ago in the 1840s and 50s, an early practitioner of liberal religion, Theodore Parker, said, "I do not pretend to understand the moral universe. The arc is a long one. My eye reaches but a little ways. I cannot calculate the curve and complete the figure by the experience of sight. I can divine it by conscience. And from what I see, I am sure it bends toward justice." And that's where that phrase comes from. Dr. King, building upon that understanding, wrote, "If today's church does not recapture the sacrificial spirit of the early church, it will lose its authenticity, forfeit the loyalty of millions, and be dismissed as an irrelevant social club with no meaning in the 20th century." And my colleague, Christopher, just told me he had heard that from time to time other colleges send students to visit. Would you be visiting us? Yeah. And at least now and then they are told to go see a cult in action. I'm okay with that, if by cult we mean to cultivate, to break up the soil of the soul that gets too packed down by familiarity, that turns into hard surfaces of dirt rather than a nourishing soil of life. Yes, we cultivate the soul here, and from time to time that means there are dandelions in our midst, but we are not here to choose the wheat and the tares. We are here to encourage all to grow, that we might someday regain that sacrificial spirit and seek that day that bends toward justice. With that in mind, we're going to sing we're going to sing a hymn that we should have sung last week, but we decided not to because we were saving time. So we're going to do it this week. This is music by Duke Ellington, and I should point out that when Jonathan played a few moments ago, music by Billy Strayhorn, they were partners, Duke Ellington and Billy Strayhorn. And so we're hearing both parts of that creative team, and they performed in this space many years ago. So we celebrate not only Duke Ellington, but Billy Strayhorn, not only African-American genius in music, but also gay genius, because Billy was closeted, but he was a powerful force in music. So shall we together sing this beautiful hymn, Come Sunday? I think it's number 202. Phil, can you help us do that?
Please make yourself comfortable. Well, good morning. As Fred mentioned, my name is Christopher Rowe, and I'm the Minister for Spiritual Life and Learning here. And there are about 100% more of you today that showed up than I thought would, so good for you. Showing up. You showed up. That's what we're going to talk about this morning, when we show up. You might notice that we got the fabric up this week. Yeah. Thank you. We got the fabric up. And you might also notice, and a few people already mentioned, that it's not in the sequential order of our diversity stake. I had a lot of people ask about that. But it is in the sequential order in which the fabric has appeared before you this year. You already know I'm high-strung. You already know I'm anxious, and I have a vision for how I want things to be done. And that was never it, but it was a team of Liz DeBraber and Fred and myself. And the two of them agreed we should start with green and work our way outwards. Well, I never admitted this to Fred, but it gave me a lot of anxiety. A ton. And so then you add on to that Liz found out that the fabric supplier couldn't get a true green like in the pride flag or the diversity stake. So we had this bright green, and here's the product. Yes, okay, sure. But we're embracing it this morning. I intentionally hung them up that way because if you remember last week, I talked about letting go, chilling out, being present in the moment, releasing that anxiety and that stress and those expectations. But the part two we didn't get to was that it's not just for me or for myself or for yourself. We need to release those expectations and release those tensions and those anxieties because we can't show up for other people if we can't show up for ourselves. And that's a big part of who we are at Fountain Street Church. So we're not just teaching our children and our youth that you need to just chill out so you can be present. No, you need to chill out so you can be present so that you can act. I think our phrase, to free the mind and grow the soul and change the world, is that call and that commandment. Free your mind, free yourself. Grow your soul, be present, be aware, and change the world. We've got to show up for ourselves so we can show up for others. And we do that all the time here. We're going to do that tomorrow when we celebrate the life and legacy of Dr. King right here with our community. And we're going to do it again later this week when we and other clergy, Fred and myself, stand in solidarity with our LGBT community. We've got to show up for ourselves so we can show up for others. I hope that this bold display of chaos, in my opinion, can call you into that. Thank you.
Show a little more. We have guests, and you're going to hear from them during the sermon portion. This is the Perugino String Quartet. And I guess you took your name from the sister city in Italy that is partnered with Grand Rapids. They've been with us before, and you'll see them this week and next week and further into the season as they've become a bit of a house ensemble in this year of preaching musically. And I'm remembering two names off the top of my head. Eric Tanner, who was the fellow with the red tie, and I believe you're connected on a voluntary basis with Stacy Tanner. Am I correct? Okay. The other two names are falling out. I remember the last name always escapes me. Corbito, yes, and you've played for us before, Barb, as a violist. I see you and Chris, thank you. Last name? Chris Martin. All of them are performers in the Grand Rapids Symphony, but they obviously do other work, and I'm really pleased that we could work out a relationship for the next couple of months so you can hear music that's dear to me and in ways that I think will enrich you. The reason I'm bringing that up now at the offering is we would not want Eric to play the cello, correct? That would probably not work out very well. And chances are even though the violinist can play the viola, they won't play it as well as Barb can because it has a funny little clef and the spaces are further apart. I'm pretty sure that even Chris and Eric could not swap instruments without feeling each other's instrument out a little bit. They're distinct. Well, the offering is your chance to understand you have a distinct gift to offer. And you symbolize that when you give money, because that is your commitment to be present, remember what Christopher said, in a way that's beyond this immediate moment. And every time you take part, you add a note to the song. You contribute to the symphony of hope. And so I remind you that our offering is divided every Sunday between sustaining this institution, which requires help, and sustaining the issues and the principles that are important to us. They go out into the community to feed the hungry, house the homeless, to do those things which we alone cannot, but which we dearly wish to be a part of. And with that in mind, I want you to swing your violin under your chin, whatever that is, not you literally, or pick up your clarinet or bang on whatever drum you have, which I mean is in that pocket or pocketbook you have nearby, so that you can add to the symphony of hope that we sing every week. Your offering of music and hope will now be most gratefully received. So I'm not going to talk about Dr. King today, in part because we covered some of those topics last week as we examined the spiritual tradition in American and African American culture, in part because there's so many other ways to engage the day and its meaning, and in part because in the end it's not about Dr. King, it's about us. And a lot of talking about Dr. King sometimes pulls us away from our responsibilities as well. For example, one of the things he said that you probably don't hear very often is when he said we must rapidly begin to shift from the thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society, when machines and computers, profit motives, and property rights are considered more important than people. Remember, he said this 60 years ago. The giant triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered as long as we focus on the things rather than the people. Just remember, that was 60 years ago. But I'm going to go in a whole different direction, although there might be a connection at the end. Let's find out. First, I'm going to embarrass someone. Not myself. I usually do that. That's my favorite subject of embarrassment, in part because I have permission. But I have permission to embarrass someone else. I spoke to Wright McCarger, who is a member of this church, who's the music director at Civic Theater, plays for our chapel band on a regular basis. And we have worked together on a couple of musical services. And during our planning a few weeks ago for one of them, he told me that as a young child, when he was in first grade, when it was time for show and tell, he decided to sing a song that his parents liked very much. This is a song by Tom Lehrer. If you don't know, Tom Lehrer was a musical humorist of the 1950s and 60s, parodies, satires of our culture. And one of them was, now remind you, he is singing this in front of his first grade class. He stood up and with the biggest voice he could summon sang the Masochism Tango. Just let that sink in for a moment. He had no idea what he was singing, but it was a great tune. In fact, he was not alone. In doing my research, I ran into this comment about Tom Lehrer's effect on children. Someone I don't know wrote this: "My parents quickly learned that they must not play certain tracks when I was awake, because I learned songs very quickly and would sing them anywhere, including at school, where the, quote, the old dope peddler was somewhat upsetting to my teacher." Now, I mention this because, for me, the tango started in that same song. I'm the same age, roughly, as Wright, and that's how I learned about that dance, through that ironic and satirical song. It is a mashup, as it were, because the masochism part refers to a trend in the mid-20th century called the Apache dance. Technically, it's the Apache dance because it's French, in which a couple, male and female, would literally beat each other up in a dance. Usually the man would throw the woman about. It's an absolute epitome of domestic violence set to music. We have changed in some ways in 60 years, after all. But it was set to a rhythm called a tango. And that's where you learn that yum, ba dum, dum, dum kind of rhythm. And it's really, it's bracing, it's exciting because, well, it's physical. We like things that are physical. And in fact, it's about as far away from the refined, elegant, serene, and intellectual world of classical music as one can go. In fact, a tango is the least likely thing you would expect to hear done persuasively by a string quartet, which is exactly why you're going to hear one now. By Astor Piazzolla. It's called Libertango. People, Not your usual string quartet sound, I would imagine. Not serene, not effete, not cerebral. Astor Piazzolla was a 20th century Argentinian-born composer, wanted to be a classical composer, went to study composition with the greatest composition teacher in the world at the time, Nadia Boulanger, who said, "This doesn't sound like you, Astor, what you're writing, these 20th century things that sound like Schoenberg and Webern. What do you play when you go home?" He says, "This," and he would start playing the tango on the piano at the studio, and Nadia would say, "That's the Astor Piazzolla, that's your genius." And he went back to Argentina and became a classical nuevo tango composer. In fact, there's an entire opera he composed called Maria de Buenos Aires, and all of the music is tango music. Exciting stuff. Why was that exciting in ways that perhaps you don't expect out of a string quartet? Because tango was first and is still and will always be a dance. And dance has a rhythm. You can't dance to something without a beat, correct? And what are rhythms but heartbeats with attitude? In some ways, dance is the original art. A great scholar of religion, Gerardus van der Leeuw, wrote a book called Sacred and Profane Beauty, the Holy in Art. And his conclusion was that all art, indeed all religion, arises out of dance. The exuberant need to do something of an expressive quality with the original instrument we have, our bodies. Now, there's a lot more to the book than that, but my point is that next week when you hear Haydn from these same people, it will still be dance music, because all music is a child of dance. There is no better example, in fact, than the classical symphony. You go to the symphony from time to time, and there's 4 movements. And they're long and short and long, and they're fast and slow, but they have their origins over 200 years ago in the orchestral suite. There'd be an overture to get everyone's attention, and then a series of movements. And when Bach wrote suites, they had names like courante and gavotte and bourrée. And if I add the names minuet or jig, you might understand that all of those were dances. And the people danced originally to those pieces of music. Now, over time, they became more elaborate, the movements became longer, and people started sitting and listening rather than dancing. But even the most elevated form of classical music has its origins in dance, some of which you can hear from time to time in one of those short movements in the middle, sometimes called a scherzo, which tears along at a brisk clip, and you just know someone's running. In fact, Richard Wagner, of dubious repute in so many ways, once described Beethoven's 7th Symphony as the apotheosis of the dance. Now, I'm being an evangelist this morning, and every morning this year, to the spiritual power of music. Classical music mostly, because that's what has moved me and fed me. But this week, it's not about the particular piece so much as the sensation that too many people think is missing from classical music, that sensation of rhythm, of passion. And what could be less passionate than the string quartet? A form of classical music that is supposed to be the most lofty, elevated, and refined. The tango is about as far from a string quartet as one can go. And yet it works, because string quartets can be exciting. The music can be exciting. Back 40 years ago, a group called the Kronos Quartet got started, and they not only did classical music, but they did encores of Jimi Hendrix, or Nine Inch Nails, or Tom Waits, or David Bowie, and persuasively, I should add, as long as the passion comes out, it doesn't matter what instruments are playing. And in fact, the string quartet is beautifully situated for it. Can you imagine watching Psycho and not hearing those screeching violins? That's passion. Can you hear Can you go and hear Jaws without the thundering, visceral lurch of the double bass? You can't get that noise anywhere else. So strings are naturally passionate. It's just the composer that keeps them under wraps too much. But it's always there if you listen for it. It takes some effort on the part of a composer to bring the emotion out. And it is that fish out of water experience you just had where your assumptions are overturned. Even composers sometimes have to get themselves out of water. When Igor Stravinsky migrated to the United States, the first piece he wrote was a tango for chamber orchestra and then subsequently rearranged. And you're going to hear it in a moment, and it is a tango, and it is a string quartet, and it still sounds like Stravinsky, and it still works. So, can you give us Stravinsky dancing this morning, friends? Now, there were some harsh notes in there, dissonant notes. And that's what Stravinsky does. He puts notes together that don't usually go in our heads. But when you think about it, would other notes have worked really any better? That's the challenge of what we think is consonant and dissonant. A week or two ago, I referred to a passage in Beethoven's Eroica Symphony in the first movement, in the development section, where the strings are doing one chord and the horns and the woodwinds are doing another, and they are completely dissonant and really loud. And you're can't stand it anymore. And then there's a brief silence. And that silence is such a relief, it feels like a consonance. And then other times a composer will introduce a silence where you want a note, and then it feels dissonant. So it's not about the sound, it's the juxtaposition of the unexpected. It is not just the notes, it is the instruments, it is the form, it is the rhythm and the quality of the experience. The art of art is to make something we take for granted new in some way. Almost 20 years ago now, I was in Florence, Italy, at the Uffizi Gallery, which is where all the big, fancy Renaissance paintings are hanging. And these are the ones you see in textbooks and in fancy books of art with their great color. And there was a bunch of Botticellis, and I was not looking forward to the Botticellis because, well, I'd seen them in all the pictures before. And they were like, oh, ho, and hum. And I walk into a room, and there is The Birth of Venus by Botticelli. And first of all, it's enormous. It's about 12 feet wide, about 5, and the colors leap off the surface, and it's thrilling beyond all measure. It's alive in a way that a color picture cannot convey. And I realized then why so many people revered that piece, because it had a vividness, of an intensity. It made the familiar new. Of course, in the 20th century, we had forms like Dada and Fauvism and Surrealism, and who here doesn't have a memory of René Magritte painting a picture of a pipe under which it says "Le Pipe," as if you needed to know what it is, or also the train coming through a fireplace, or hats with no one underneath, or Salvador Dali with his dripping clocks, as though they were new. But years before that, artists created what they called trompe-l'oeil pictures that are meant to fool the eye, quite literally. Rembrandt Peale, an American artist in the late 18th and early 19th century, painted a trompe-l'oeil at the top of his stairway as though there were a door there. And George Washington, when he visited, took his hat off to the man standing in the doorway as he went by. Again, taking the obvious and the for granted and making it new again. And what, of course, makes a soup can into art, except that we see it with new eyes. And that's what brings me to this church and what makes this a sermon. In some ways, we are the René Magritte of churches. Things don't add up the usual way here. The string quartet playing a tango is different. We are a religion where that can happen, and it's spiritual because we choose to look at it that way. We are a place where waiting for Godot or sitting on the dock of the bay can be as powerful to us as any prayer about God or any passage in Scripture. It's what we do. And for the same reason, to find the sublime in the ordinary, to summon the sacred out of the supposedly profane, to remember that there is nothing that is not shot through with meaning if we pay attention to it. In this respect, we are very good Christians because Jesus reminded his followers that the lilies of the field were more splendid than Solomon, which is manifestly not true until you look at the lilies of the field anew. He also reminded him that children understood the truth better than adults, which is manifestly not true until you listen to a child and really pay attention. In some respects, the liberal church in all its forms is called to see the world in a grain of sand, which is a quote from William Blake, the great romantic, visionary, insane poet of the late 18th century. It's a wonderful poem, and those words are actually in our hymn book. To see the world in a grain of sand and heaven in a wildflower, to hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. Those juxtapositions, those paradoxes are what matter. Call it dissonance, if you will. Those moments are when we are jarred from the familiar are what make spirituality possible. In Luke, Jesus answers the question, who is my neighbor, with the story of the Good Samaritan. And we all know that story, but very few people know the backstory to it. Nobody liked Samaritans in Judea. They were a hated minority. They were lower than people of color in America. They were also feared. And so when Jesus tells the story that fellow Jews did not help this Jew on the road and then puts a Samaritan, he's asking them to look beyond their assumptions about who is good and who is bad. Not to say this one is bad and this one is good, but to let go of assumptions that prevent you from seeing the entirety. So when he says the kingdom of God is among you, or anyone who cannot receive the kingdom of God like a child, Jesus is posing a dissonance of the mind. These stories are not nostrums about innocence or about niceness, but daring paradoxes that say the world that you think you know is far more than you realize. Now, I could go on and get all sorts of esoteric, but if you try to explain a paradox, you destroy it. Better to let the dissonant be dissonant, so it puzzles you and bothers you, and you can find the consonants on your own. And in fact, I can demonstrate how it happens musically. Early in his career, when he decided to try to become a classical composer, not just a songwriter, George Gershwin went and got lessons. And his first piece that he wrote, a kind of a study, was something he called a lullaby for string quartet. His first serious piece, which he shoved in a drawer and was not discovered until after he died. So no one heard it until the 1960s. It combines the intimacy of a string quartet with the syncopated rhythm of a tango of all things. It's a lullaby, it is a tango, and the harmonies of jazz, which technically are very dissonant but somehow work. And it is a sign of his genius that in one small piece, so many paradoxical things can be brought together. But I saved that for last, so you would have something less dissonant, but nonetheless intriguing to conclude our message. I find it possible to imagine singing to a child. And anyone who's had a small child knows that as they fall asleep, you sing softer and softer and softer and close the door. Art, according to Martin Heidegger, that most controversial of philosophers, art opens a world. Each artwork reveals a truth in some way, which is all that religion claims as well. So no wonder that religion and art have traveled so closely together over the eons. They are siblings. When they meet with unexpected passion and dissonance, truth happens. One could quite literally say that they are partners in the tango of truth. And so we look to art to reveal our faith, and faith to open us to art, that we may be more the person we can be as well as the people we are. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be found true in thy sight, thou who art my rock and my Redeemer. I thank you, Perugino Quartet. See you next week. It is time for us to bow our heads or lift our hearts or open our minds or whatever posture you need to pray. For prayer is in fact an opening, not a closing, a listening more than a speaking. We ask not for some blessing, because the blessing is ever present. It is in the air itself that we are taking a breath. We are permitted to take breath after breath, and without even thinking are nourished by it. The blessing of light and warmth is with us at every stage. We are being nourished without even realizing it. And then around us, the faces we know and cherish, voices we find as balms to our hearts and souls, and those new and fresh and unknown, perhaps with a mote of anxiety that we don't know who they are, and yet we know that in them moves the same blood, courses the same life as within us. We rejoice in prayer, that is to say thanks, that is to say appreciates all those things that unrecognized happen from moment to moment and sustain us all. But we also know, and if we do not give thanks, we give honor to those struggles we all carry within us, whether they be illness of body or sickness of heart, whether they be struggles of mind or of matter. For no one in this world is exempt from the burdens that life also imposes. We hear in our hearts other heartbeats. We know they too are along the path we walk. Our prayer is that we may hear the music that sends us from moment to moment, that we may dance even as we stumble, and sing even as we groan, to know that all things, if not a blessing, are given as a gift, that we are here to notice, to lay our eyes and hearts upon them, to give ear to all that the heart has to say. And so we pause between the heartbeats with the exhale and the inhale. And in wordless words, say thank you. I'm sorry. Help me. We also lift our hearts in gratitude for those whose lives came to their conclusion at this time in years past. Lifting up the names of Janet Bacon and Mel Goolsby, George Meyer, Bev Howerton, Leroy Schiffler, Dorothy Spaulding, Lawson Becker, Barb McCann, Stuart Hoffius, Eleanor Gilson, Jean Norwalk, Lucia Stewart, Bernard Soper. God, filled with mercy, dwelling in the heavens' heights, bring proper rest beneath the wings of your presence to the souls of our beloveds who have gone to their eternal rest. May you, who are the source of mercy, shelter them beneath your wings eternally. Bind their souls to we, the living, and to you, that they may rest at peace, that we may be at peace. And may we ever say, amen. I invite us all to share now in blessing this hour with a hymn, number 312, here on the paths of every day. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, said Dr. King, tied in a single garment of destiny. There are some things in our social system to which we all ought to be maladjusted, and therefore we must evolve for all of us a method which rejects revenge, aggression, and retaliation. We shall hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. Go forth, therefore, with these words and others, knowing that this day, and indeed every day, is a day which the Lord has made. Let us ever rejoice and be glad, and indeed count our many blessings until we meet again. Amen and amen.
One foot from the other, and lead with love. Put one foot in front of the other, and lead with love. Sing with us. Gotta put one foot in front of the other, and lead with love. Put one foot in front of the other, and lead with love. You gotta put one foot in front of the other.